What do you get when you mix tuxedos, teacups, and decades of betrayal? Not a soap opera. A history of Britain's most beloved actors cheating on their wives. These were the knights of stage and screen, the gentlemen of cinema. And behind closed doors, the chaos was anything but scripted. Affairs hidden in plain sight. Marriages unraveling between takes. Welcome to the side of British cinema they don't teach at RADA, where charm was a weapon and fidelity rarely made it past opening night. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a story that makes you rethink everything. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from and what time is it right now? Midnight confession? Morning scandal? We're listening. 1. Richard Burton. They say love is war, but Richard Burton preferred it messy, expensive, and tabloid-worthy. Before the public fell in love with him and Elizabeth Taylor, someone else already had. Sybil Williams, his first wife and the woman he left smoldering in the ashes of his real-life soap opera. Burton wasn't the first actor to cheat on his wife, but he might have been the first to turn it into international entertainment. The headlines came with exclamation marks. But the betrayal, as always, came quietly first, in long hotel corridors and longer silences at home. Burton, a Welshman born with volcanic self-destruction in his lungs, had married Sybil in 1949. They had children, they had arguments, they had fame, but none of that stood a chance when Elizabeth Taylor came along, on the set of Cleopatra no less, and detonated whatever vows had survived the slow burn of celebrity life. What followed was not an affair, it was a televised obsession. Paparazzi hounded them from yachts to private planes. The Vatican issued a statement. Congress debated morality clauses. Sybil, meanwhile, moved back to the quiet shadows, while Burton became half of the most scandalous love story the 20th century never asked for. He cheated loudly, then divorced discreetly. It wasn't his only affair, just the most cinematic. And in the end, he and Taylor married, divorced, and married again. A loop of lust and loathing that looked glamorous until you really listened to them speak. She was the only woman I ever loved, Burton once said, but he said it after he'd already broken the one who loved him first. And if that sounds romantic to you, you may want to hear what happened to Vivien Leigh. 2. Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier didn't cheat like a fool, he cheated like a craftsman, with precision, restraint, and Shakespearean irony. On stage, he was King Lear, Hamlet, Othello. Off stage, he was less tragic and more tactically slippery. His affair with Joan Plowright, for instance, was whispered before it was reported, a backstage murmur that eventually exploded into biographical certainty. But let's not skip the important name here. Vivien Leigh, a woman so luminous she eclipsed entire rooms. She was already famous when Olivier fell in love with her, while both were married to other people. They divorced their spouses, married each other, and lit up London like literary gods. But if you think that's where the story ends, if you believe that cheating once to be together means you'll never cheat again, then you haven't read enough doomed romance. Olivier was not an easy man. He craved acclaim more than stability. Leigh, meanwhile, battled bipolar disorder, and their marriage spiraled into heartbreak disguised as elegance. By the 1950s, their affection had eroded into quiet betrayals and polite abandonment. Olivier began seeing Plowright. Leigh knew. Of course she knew. She just refused to admit it, even as the truth scratched louder behind closed doors. By the time Olivier left her, officially and publicly, Leigh was unraveling, her mental health collapsing under the weight of 1,000 polite betrayals. Olivier's defenders say he had no choice. Critics say he'd made it long before she ever fell apart. Either way, the legend left the goddess in ruins. But while Olivier slipped away quietly, Kenneth Branagh would do it under the full glare of modern celebrity, dragging another national treasure down with him. And if you're still with us, clearly you like your history with a twist. So go ahead and subscribe for more stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from and what time is it over there? Are we ruining your morning or keeping you company past midnight? 3. Kenneth Branagh. If British cinema had a golden boy in the early 90s, it was Kenneth Branagh. The new Olivier, they called him. A Shakespearean genius, a directorial prodigy. And for a while, it looked like his marriage to Emma Thompson was just as golden, a perfectly cheekboned union of intellect and charm. Until, of course, it wasn't. The affair with Helena Bonham Carter didn't start with fireworks. It started on the set of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, fittingly. A gothic romance wrapped in horror, directed by Branagh himself, starring himself, featuring his future mistress as his co-star. The symbolism was not subtle, nor was the fallout. It was never officially confirmed in tabloids with screaming headlines, but it didn't need to be. The timeline spoke volumes. So did Thompson's public grace, which only made the betrayal sting deeper. Years later, she admitted the pain left a black hole, a phrase more devastating than any exposé. And while she never named names with venom, the public connected the dots. Branagh and Bonham Carter became an item. Thompson moved on, eventually, triumphantly. But the scars stayed, and the nation picked sides. Branagh's reputation took a hit it never quite recovered from. Sure, he still directed, still acted, still won awards, but the sheen was dulled. He wasn't the golden boy anymore. He was the man who broke Emma Thompson's heart, the man who brought a little too much method acting to his Frankenstein. And while Branagh's affair lived in the tabloids, Rowan Atkinson slipped in under the radar, proving that even Mr. Bean has his secrets. 4. Rowan Atkinson. Rowan Atkinson built an empire on silence. As Mr. Bean, he communicated with nothing but facial contortions and well-timed disasters. In interviews, he came across as private, precise, and almost pathologically low-key. So when the story broke that the man who could barely squeak on screen had quietly left his wife for a much younger actress, the press nearly choked on the irony. The woman in question was Louise Ford, a stage performer best known for playing Kate Middleton in a satire. Atkinson, then still married to Sunetra Sastry, his wife of over 2 decades and the mother of his children, had reportedly begun the relationship before the marriage officially ended. The split wasn't loud. There were no bitter public statements, no courtroom showdowns, just a clean break, and a quick move-in with Ford. The British press, ever thirsty but deeply polite about certain icons, didn't quite know how to frame it. Was it an affair? A midlife revelation? A Mr. Bean sketch gone existential? Atkinson, for his part, said nothing. He never confirmed timelines, never offered apologies, never performed contrition. He just moved on. And eventually had a child with Ford, well after the divorce dust had settled. There was no scandalous photo, no emotional interview, just a quiet rearranging of his personal life while the world blinked and asked, wait, him too? Because if the most awkward, most seemingly gentle man in British comedy can betray a long-standing marriage, then what hope do the rest of us have? Apparently, not much. Just ask Charles Dance, who managed to cheat with such casual nobility, people almost forgot to be mad about it. 5. Charles Dance. Charles Dance has always played villains with class, calculating dukes, cruel generals, and icy patriarchs, all delivered with that sharp diction and colder smile. So when he admitted, quite matter-of-factly, that infidelity helped end his 34-year marriage, no one really blinked. Of course he did. He probably cheated while wearing a 3-piece suit and quoting Byron. Dance married Joanna Haythorne long before Game of Thrones turned him into a late-career icon. Back then, he was a stage actor with a crisp jawline and a wandering eye. When asked about the breakdown of his marriage, he didn't dodge. He said in so many words that he hadn't been the greatest husband in the world. It was the kind of British understatement that usually hides a landfill of regret. There weren't paparazzi chases or screaming front pages, just a slow, public reckoning with the fact that one of the country's most distinguished actors had, well, behaved like a man in midlife crisis. After the split, he dated younger women, some of whom made it into glossy tabloids, champagne in hand, decades his junior. It was all very tasteful, very quiet, very dance. And yet, behind the charm and the civility, there's a story of a long marriage that eroded not from chaos, but from cool detachment, the kind of infidelity that wears cologne and forgets anniversaries, the type that doesn't scandalize, just corrodes. Still, while Dance owned up to his mistakes in that clipped, regretful tone, the next man on our list was a little less restrained. In fact, when it came to personal chaos, Anthony Hopkins didn't just flirt with the darkness. He invited it in, offered it a drink, and left the door open on purpose. 6. Anthony Hopkins. Anthony Hopkins never pretended to be a saint. That's probably why he's played so many sinners so well. But behind the scenes, in the quieter moments between awards and monologues, his personal life told a story just as fractured, just as morally murky, as any of his characters. During his marriage to Jennifer Linton, which lasted nearly 3 decades, Hopkins was distant in more ways than one. There were long absences, emotional silences, and eventually, open acknowledgments that the marriage had survived more out of habit than happiness. And somewhere in that slow unraveling, there were affairs. Not tabloid-fueled, not caught on camera, but quietly documented in the folds of profile pieces and authorized biographies. He admitted to being unfaithful. He also admitted to being emotionally cold, to not speaking to his own daughter for years, to being not particularly fond of family life. If that sounds bleak, well, it was. Hopkins never wore a mask of domestic bliss. He simply let the erosion happen, occasionally tossing out fragments of regret in interviews the way others throw out anecdotes. And yet, through all this, the public never really turned on him. Maybe because his roles, Hannibal Lecter, the cold patriarchs, the crumbling geniuses, prepared us. Or maybe because he was too honest to cancel. There's something chillingly admirable about a man who admits he was the villain in his own home. Still, as emotionally distant as Hopkins was, he didn't hold a candle to what Roger Moore was up to. Because the next man on this list didn't just have affairs. He made them part of the furniture. 7. Roger Moore. Roger Moore smiled while cheating. Not metaphorically, literally. The man was all charm, all suave British politeness with a wink at the camera, even when the lights were off and the marriage was crumbling. He played James Bond like a man who was in on the joke, the tuxedoed seducer who knew it was absurd, but leaned in anyway. In real life, the absurdity wasn't in the tuxedo. It was in the decades-long carousel of romances, affairs, and polite divorces, all carried off with the grace of a man who somehow kept getting away with it. Moore's first marriage, to skater Dorn Van Stein, ended in a hurricane of accusations, mostly hers. His second, to Italian singer Dorothy Squires, was even messier. By the time he met Luisa Mattioli, the woman he'd eventually marry next, he was still legally married to Squires. The overlap wasn't exactly subtle. It played out across European tabloids like a bad opera, but Moore, ever unbothered, simply shrugged it off. He'd found someone new. The rest, apparently, was just paperwork. Even in later interviews, Moore admitted to his affairs with the kind of breezy detachment usually reserved for holiday anecdotes. Yes, he cheated. No, he wasn't proud. But also, and here's the subtext, what did you expect from James Bond? He seemed almost confused by the idea that anyone would be shocked. It's hard to say whether Moore believed in marriage or just in the ceremony of it. What's clear is that his romantic life had more rotating cast members than a long-running soap. He wasn't a villain. He was something worse for some people, the man who made cheating look polite. But not every unfaithful legend came with a smirk. Some, like Rex Harrison, preferred their scandals in tragic tones, usually with someone else's tears. 8. Rex Harrison. Rex Harrison didn't just play Henry Higgins. He was Henry Higgins. Arrogant, charming, unrepentantly self-involved. And behind the scenes, his romantic life played out like a never-ending act of psychological theater. His marriages, of which there were 6, functioned more like temporary ceasefires between the wars. Affairs were common. Regret was rare. Harrison's personal life was a tangle of triangles, each one more dramatic than the last. He cheated during most of his marriages, often with women from the stage or the silver screen. His affair with Carol Landis, a Hollywood actress, ended in infamy. Landis was found dead in her home shortly after a visit from Harrison. He claimed innocence. Others whispered. The scandal nearly ruined him, but not quite. He carried on. He always carried on. His marriage to actress Kay Kendall is remembered as a strange mix of nobility and deceit. When Kendall was diagnosed with leukemia, a diagnosis hidden from her, per her doctor's instructions, Harrison married her anyway. Some called it heroic. Others wondered whether guilt played a role. After she died, he returned to the pattern. More relationships, more chaos, more quiet departures. By the time biographies started tallying up the emotional wreckage, Harrison had long since passed the point of public redemption. His acting stayed brilliant. His personal life stayed bitter. There's something chilling about a man who can perform love so convincingly while seemingly unable to live it honestly. Still, if Harrison's affairs were theatrical, the next man's were pure bacchanalia. Because when it came to marital betrayal, Oliver Reed didn't just cheat, he turned it into a lifestyle. 9. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed never aimed for subtlety. He was the kind of man who drank breakfast, picked fights with reporters, and wore his chaos like a badge. When it came to marriage, fidelity wasn't a line he crossed. It was a concept he barely acknowledged. His wife knew. The tabloids knew. Even Reed himself admitted it, usually mid-interview, usually half-drunk. Married to Josephine Burge, who was decades younger, Reed reportedly carried on affairs without much attempt at discretion. To him, monogamy was an ideal for lesser men, the quiet, obedient types. Reed was none of those things. He believed in passion, appetite, and the idea that consequences were for other people. But Reed's infidelity wasn't about seduction. It was about power, impulse, and the deep theatricality of destruction. His entire persona, both on screen and off, was built on excess. Women, alcohol, fights, notoriety. He didn't want to be liked. He wanted to be legendary, and cheating was just another act in that mythology. There's something tragic about it, of course, because beneath the bravado and the loud public image was a man clearly wrestling with demons. Friends said he was brilliant and generous. His wife stayed with him, despite it all. Maybe because she knew she wasn't married to a man. She was married to a fire that occasionally took human form. Reed died in Malta, reportedly after a drinking contest with British sailors, right in the middle of filming Gladiator. The chaos didn't end. It simply cut to black. And if you think that's dramatic, wait until you meet Richard Harris, the man who once claimed he couldn't remember how many affairs he'd had, only that they came between him and his lines. 10. Richard Harris. Richard Harris lived as if restraint were a personal insult. He drank like a man outrunning silence, laughed like someone allergic to consequences, and loved with the kind of recklessness that leaves emotional debris scattered across decades. When it came to marriage, Harris didn't exactly reject fidelity. He just treated it as a vague suggestion, easily drowned out by another night, another woman, another story that began with, "You'll never believe this." Married to Elizabeth Reese Williams in the early years of his fame, Harris's infidelity was not a secret whispered behind hands. It was an accepted hazard of being near him. Biographical accounts describe repeated affairs, some brief, some entangled, all orbiting a man who seemed constitutionally incapable of staying put, emotionally or geographically. Acting jobs took him away for months. Drinking took him further. The marriage, unsurprisingly, collapsed under the weight of both. Harris later spoke about this era with a mix of bravado and regret, the way some men talk about a war they volunteered for and then lost. He didn't frame himself as a victim, but he also didn't linger on the damage. That was for others to process. Wives, children, people who didn't have the luxury of mythologizing chaos as charm. And yet, Harris remained beloved. There was something magnetic about his self-awareness, the way he could confess to being deeply flawed without ever truly changing. He knew he was destructive. He just didn't stop. Perhaps because stopping would mean sitting alone with the wreckage. By the time his career entered its later renaissance, Unforgiven, Harry Potter, the scandals were softened into anecdotes. The affairs became footnotes. History, it seems, is kinder to men who age into gravitas. But the next man on our list didn't rely on chaos or alcohol to explain his betrayal. His scandal unfolded in a cooler, quieter way, the kind that makes headlines whisper instead of shout. And somehow, that made it sting more. 11. Ralph Fiennes. Ralph Fiennes has always looked like a man carrying a secret. Not a messy one, but a carefully folded one, tucked neatly into the inner pocket of a tailored coat. His performances radiate control, intellect, and restraint. Which is why, when reports surfaced of an affair during his marriage to Alex Kingston, the story felt less explosive and more surgical. Fiennes and Kingston met young, before global fame hardened their edges. They married in 1993, just as both careers were accelerating. But success has a way of introducing temptation under the guise of opportunity. While details were never splashed with vulgar enthusiasm, widely circulated reports linked Fiennes to another woman during the marriage, a narrative that quickly became inseparable from their eventual divorce. Kingston, in later interviews, spoke with candor and clarity, making it clear the betrayal cut deep. There was no public mudslinging, no courtroom drama for the tabloids to feast on, just a quiet understanding that something essential had broken and could not be repaired. Fiennes, as always, said little. He didn't deny. He didn't elaborate. Silence became his shield, and in a strange way, it worked. His career surged forward, untarnished in the eyes of critics and casting directors alike. Audiences continued to admire the intensity, the discipline, the intelligence. The personal cost remained offstage. But that's the unsettling part, isn't it? How easily a betrayal can vanish when it's wrapped in dignity. How clean some scandals are allowed to be. No chaos, no shouting, just a marriage quietly erased. And if you think quiet endings are merciful, wait until you hear about Christopher Timothy, whose confession didn't come wrapped in silence, but in the kind of honesty that changes how you hear a person's voice forever. 12. Christopher Timothy. Christopher Timothy will always be remembered as the warm-hearted veterinarian from All Creatures Great and Small, kind, patient, reassuring. A man you trusted instinctively, which is why the end of his marriage to Linda Bellingham landed with such uncomfortable force. When the truth came out, it wasn't whispered by tabloids or inferred through timelines. It was admitted. Timothy had an affair. He said so himself. And unlike many men on this list, he didn't attempt to soften it with poetic language or professional distance. He acknowledged the damage plainly. The marriage ended, and Bellingham, years later, spoke openly about the pain, not with bitterness, but with a clarity that made the betrayal feel even heavier. What made this story sting wasn't the scandal. It was the contrast. The man who played empathy for a living had failed to practice it where it mattered most. And there was no myth-making to hide behind. No larger-than-life persona. Just two people, one choice, and the long shadow it cast. Timothy didn't disappear after the divorce, nor did he reinvent himself as a tragic genius or misunderstood rogue. He carried on, working, living, aging, with the knowledge that some mistakes don't fade, they settle. They become part of the landscape. There's something quietly devastating about that, because it reminds us that infidelity doesn't require excess, fame, or madness. Sometimes it comes from ordinary weakness, and sometimes the most unsettling betrayals are the ones that look the most human. But if Timothy's story was about honesty, the next one swings violently in the opposite direction. Because when Ian McShane cheated, he didn't confess, he boasted. 13. Ian McShane. Ian McShane never bothered with the polished illusions. He played rogues and lived like one, with whiskey in one hand, charm in the other, and fidelity nowhere in sight. Long before he became the gravel-voiced anti-hero of Deadwood, McShane was already leaving behind a trail of scorched romances and barbed interviews. He didn't just admit to cheating. He joked about it. Repeatedly. On record. The end of his marriage to Susan Farmer came like a slow collapse. One of those unravelings where no one is surprised, just exhausted. His affair, reportedly with Dutch actress Sylvia Kristel, was less a secret and more a shrug. McShane once referred to himself, without a trace of self-censorship, as a complete bastard during that time. Honesty, yes. Growth, maybe not. Profiles describe his infidelity as rampant. Not a one-time mistake, not a lapse. A pattern. A rhythm. The cost? One broken marriage and likely a few friendships frayed beyond repair. But McShane seemed to wear it all with a mix of defiance and fatalism, like a man who knew exactly what he was and saw no point pretending otherwise. There's a strange comfort in villains who announce themselves. McShane didn't market remorse, just realism. He was young, famous, volatile, a bad husband by his own admission, and a man who somehow made being unrepentant look entertaining. That's the unsettling part. But while McShane's affairs were loud and self-authored, the next scandal was built from whispers and long lenses. A man caught not by confession, but by cameras. Because when Dominic West cheated, it wasn't a rumor. It was a photograph. 14. Dominic West. In October 2020, Dominic West became the main character of the internet, for all the wrong reasons. The photos were unambiguous. West and actress Lily James, strolling around Rome, kissing at a cafe, riding on a scooter like it was a romantic comedy nobody asked for. The problem? West was married, still is technically, and the internet noticed. Within hours, headlines exploded. Social media caught fire. But instead of silence, West and his wife, Catherine Fitzgerald, staged one of the most surreal PR responses in recent memory. They emerged from their home, kissed for the cameras, and held up a handwritten note that read, "Our marriage is strong and we're very much still together." It was less a statement and more a hostage note from a romantic farce. The public reaction was swift and confused. Some saw a couple attempting damage control. Others saw performance art. West never confirmed or denied the affair. He didn't need to. The photos spoke louder than any denial ever could. What made this scandal so gripping wasn't just the betrayal. It was the theater of denial. The cheerful posing, the shaky smiles, the script being rewritten in real time, while everyone else already knew how the story ended. And yet, West carried on. No major career crash, no lengthy apology tour, just a man walking back into work, as if nothing had happened, leaving the internet to stitch together meaning from silence and subtext. But while West's scandal felt strangely modern, the next one belongs to a very different era. One where rumors traveled slower, but reputations unraveled just the same. Because Peter Sellers wasn't just Britain's most unpredictable comic genius. He may have destroyed his own marriage chasing a fantasy that never really existed. 15. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was a man of many voices, literally. He could slip in and out of characters with uncanny precision, often losing himself in the process. But while the world laughed at Inspector Clouseau, behind closed doors, Sellers' personal life veered between obsession, insecurity, and sabotage. His marriage to Britt Ekland, the glamorous Swedish actress, was chaotic enough. But the real storm may have started earlier, with whispers of an affair that still feels more myth than memory. The name? Sophia Loren. Sellers became infatuated with her during the late 1950s while filming The Millionairess. Reports vary on whether an actual affair occurred. Loren has consistently denied it. But Sellers, married at the time to Anne Howe, reportedly became obsessed. Unhealthily so. He pursued Loren with a mix of romantic desperation and delusional certainty. The fixation, whether reciprocated or not, shook the foundations of his marriage. Friends and biographers describe Sellers as emotionally unstable, prone to jealous rages, and capable of swinging from affectionate to ice-cold in minutes. His marriage to Howe didn't survive the fallout. Nor did subsequent ones, really. He was married 4 times, and each ended under a cloud of either betrayal, volatility, or both. What makes Sellers' infidelity unsettling isn't just the act, it's the intention. The way he blurred the line between love and performance, fantasy and reality. When he fell obsessively, destructively, and often publicly. And yet, he was never quite canceled. People called him a genius. They still do. But behind the genius was a man who couldn't stop rewriting the script of his own life, usually at the expense of those closest to him. And if that sounds like a cautionary tale, wait until we meet David Niven, the gentleman actor whose most shocking alleged affair involved royalty. 16. David Niven. David Niven had the smile of a gentleman and the secrets of a politician. Always impeccably dressed, always ready with a quip. He moved through life like a man who had already read the script and wasn't particularly worried about the third act. But behind the impeccable manners and Oxbridge charm was a personal life that didn't quite match the press releases, especially when it came to fidelity. Niven was married twice, but it's his second marriage, to Eurydice Genberg, that drew the quietest scandals. Their relationship, by most biographical accounts, was turbulent. He was often away. She was reportedly lonely, and their lifestyle, glamorous, global, champagne-laced, didn't lend itself to old-fashioned devotion. Then there's the royal rumor. Biographer Graham Lord made the claim in his 2003 book that Niven, late in life, had an affair with none other than Princess Margaret. It wasn't confirmed, of course. These things rarely are. But the allegation was specific enough to raise eyebrows, especially given the princess's own reputation for rebellious taste in men. Niven was charming, witty, and securely within the aristocratic adjacent set that the royal family quietly tolerated. And if the affair happened, if the biographer wasn't just chasing tabloid ghosts, it would have occurred during Niven's later years, while still married. He never commented on it. He rarely commented on anything deeply personal. That was part of the act, the well-mannered deflection, the polite evasions. But the silence was rarely empty. It was filled with implications. Niven died as he lived, beloved, elusive, and just a little too perfect to be real. Which makes what comes next even more fascinating. Because Peter Finch, another screen legend, didn't just cheat behind closed doors. He did it with someone else's wife. Someone very famous. 17. Peter Finch. Peter Finch was born in London, raised in Australia, and eventually became one of Britain's most celebrated actors. He was magnetic, moody, and often underestimated, until he wasn't. But while his film roles were complex and brooding, his private life was simple in one regard. He followed his desires, no matter the collateral damage. Finch was married to South African ballerina Tamara Chinarova when he began a now-famous affair with none other than Vivien Leigh. Yes, that Vivien Leigh, still married to Laurence Olivier at the time. It was a tangled triangle of theatrical proportions. Leigh and Olivier, the golden couple of British stage, pulled apart not just by fame and illness, but by infidelity that played out like one of their own tragedies. Finch and Leigh met while co-starring in Elephant Walk, and their connection reportedly ignited quickly. It wasn't just emotional, it was magnetic. And for a while it was also very real. Chinarova, Finch's wife, later claimed the affair devastated their marriage, a marriage that soon ended. Leigh's own marriage to Olivier, already under strain, deteriorated further. Nobody walked away undamaged. But Finch didn't stop there. Accounts describe other affairs throughout his life, usually with actresses, often with married women. There was a restlessness in him, an inability to live within the bounds of a script. He died young, just 60, shortly after winning a posthumous Oscar for Network. The irony was cruel. Finally recognized, just in time to miss it. Finch's affair with Leigh remains one of Hollywood's less tidy scandals. Too complex for easy judgment, too painful for nostalgia. But if Finch's betrayals were fueled by romantic chaos, Michael Redgrave's infidelity carried a different weight entirely. Because sometimes, the secret isn't who you're with, it's who you are. 18. Michael Redgrave. Michael Redgrave was a towering figure of British theatre, a patriarch of a dynasty, a knighted legend, and, quietly, a man living two lives. He married actress Rachel Kempson in 1935. To the public, they were a model of artistic union, elegant, disciplined, enduring. But privately, Redgrave's romantic life was far more complex, and his infidelities were not just numerous, they were layered with secrets. Biographers describe a pattern of affairs, with both women and men, stretching across much of his adult life. One particularly striking account suggests that Redgrave began an affair while his wife was pregnant, a detail that feels almost operatic in its cruelty. Yet Kempson stayed. Whether out of love, pragmatism, or silent understanding, she remained beside him as he moved through his long career, carrying the weight of public decorum and private contradiction. Redgrave was known in inner circles as bisexual, though the term itself was rarely spoken in his lifetime. In an era when discretion wasn't just preferred but essential, he conducted much of his personal life in the margins, coded, veiled, known, but never named. His affairs were the kind of open secrets that make history feel like theater with the curtain never fully lifted. There's a quiet tragedy in that duality. Redgrave wasn't cruel exactly, just compartmentalized. Emotionally precise on stage, emotionally unavailable at home. His children, including actors Vanessa and Corin Redgrave, would later speak with great complexity about their father, admiring his art, haunted by his distance. But if Redgrave's infidelity was shrouded in repression, Michael Gambon's was something else entirely, a second life hidden in plain sight, and a scandal that stayed public for decades without ever being properly explained. 19. Michael Gambon. Michael Gambon once said, "I lie all the time, but I mean well." It was meant to be a joke. Maybe. But when you look at his personal life, the line starts to feel more like a confession wrapped in charm. Sir Michael Gambon, the man millions came to adore as Dumbledore, lived a dual existence off-screen that most actors wouldn't dare attempt on stage. For nearly 2 decades, he maintained 2 families, simultaneously, publicly, and with astonishing calm. His wife, Ann Miller, lived in the couple's longtime home. Meanwhile, Gambon spent much of his time with set designer Philippa Hart, who was decades younger and bore him 2 sons. Both relationships overlapped for years. Neither was exactly hidden. In fact, by the time tabloids caught on, the story wasn't that Gambon had been caught. It was that no one had quite believed it was real until then. But it was, publicly real. At events, he'd sometimes bring Hart. He didn't hide. He just never explained, and neither woman ever gave a tell-all. No messy divorces, no courtroom drama, just a strangely British arrangement of quiet tolerance and strategic silence. After Gambon's passing in 2023, his will reignited the discussion. He left his fortune to his wife, nothing reportedly to Hart or their children. Some saw this as cruel, others as inevitable. But the truth, as always, lay buried somewhere in the space between the myth of the great actor and the ordinary mess of the man. And if Gambon's affair was defined by its longevity, the next one comes with a different flavor. Fleeting, exposed, and followed by a wave of regret. Because Patrick Stewart's betrayal didn't just end a marriage, it rewrote how his ex-wife remembered the entire relationship. 20. Patrick Stewart. Patrick Stewart speaks like a man who's been through war, on stage, in fiction, and in life. Calm, reflective, refined. But when his ex-wife, Sheila Falconer, broke her silence decades after their divorce, the narrative took on a sharper edge. According to her, the marriage didn't just end, it collapsed under the weight of betrayal. Stewart rarely discussed his first marriage publicly. They were together for over 2 decades, shared children, and for the longest time, the story was that they simply grew apart. But Falconer, in interviews tied to Stewart's 2023 memoir, accused him of diminishing her story, glossing over the infidelity that, in her view, fractured their family. The affair wasn't tabloid fodder at the time. It flew under the radar, but it left scars that didn't fade with time. The painful irony? Stewart had become an icon of morality, a Shakespearean elder statesman, a captain, a professor, and in recent years, an advocate for emotional openness and accountability. But Falconer's words painted a different portrait, one of a man who, for all his gravitas, rewrote the past in his favor. Did Stewart cheat? The memoir doesn't say directly, but the omissions, the tone, the carefully curated memory, all suggest that the truth wasn't so much denied as quietly buried. And Falconer, decades later, refused to let it stay that way. It's a jarring reminder that even the most beloved figures carry histories far messier than their public images suggest, and that sometimes dignity is just well-rehearsed silence. But if Stewart's scandal echoed quietly into the future, Charlie Chaplin's reverberated backward into a shadowy past of whispered lawsuits, sensational headlines, and a personal life so chaotic even Hollywood blinked. 21. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was one of Britain's greatest cinematic exports, a silent-era icon who became a global myth. But the further you dig into his personal life, the more it resembles a tabloid fever dream wrapped in legal drama and moral contradiction. His public image was all bowler hat and innocent mischief. Off-screen? Not so innocent. Chaplin's romantic life was relentless. 4 marriages, dozens of affairs, and at least one scandal that nearly ended his career. The most infamous, his relationship with Joan Barry. She was a young actress. He was already married. Their affair turned toxic, and when Barry filed a paternity suit in 1943, it became a national obsession. The court eventually ruled Chaplin the father, even though blood tests said otherwise, because in 1940s America, paternity tests weren't admissible as evidence. Yes, really, this case alone would have been enough to sink most men. But Chaplin wasn't most men. He was defended, condemned, rebranded, and ultimately exiled. In 1952, while traveling to Europe, he was denied re-entry to the United States over suspicions about his politics and private behavior. His reputation had become radioactive. Even before Barry, Chaplin's affairs were infamous, often with women much younger than him, sometimes overlapping his marriages. His third wife, Paulette Goddard, left him after years of emotional turbulence. His final marriage, to Una O'Neill, was surprisingly long-lasting. But the stains of his earlier choices never quite washed away. Chaplin's legacy is a contradiction. The clown who made the world laugh, and the man whose private betrayals became public battlegrounds. He built silent masterpieces. But his scandals? Those were loud. And as the credits roll on this list of legends, one question lingers. When the applause fades, what kind of man is left standing in the wings?